Hello all, today we are going to see how from a child inner function we can access the parent context. So in case when we want the inner function to have the same context as the parent function. So for example, here I have an inner function and I want this to have the same context as the parent function, that is func1. So this is a simple example I have taken. This is the object, okay, and I'm calling this func1 as a object method variable of this obj, okay. So as you would have guessed that this here will point to the object obj, since I have called it as a method, okay. But if you take the inner function, will refer to the window object, since the inner function is called with implicit windows, okay. But our requirement here is to make this inner function have the same context as the outer parent function, that is func1. So this should represent the obj object, okay. How to do that? We can do it in 5 ways, okay, using call, apply, bind, ES6 function style and temporary variables. Let us see the first way to do that. You can use call, that is you can call it as inner function dot call this, okay. What I am saying is call the inner function in this context. So this will correspond to this func1 context, that is the obj context. So in this way we can make this to point to the obj object, okay. This is one way. The second way is to do apply. It works almost similar to call, but here I don't require any arguments, so it looks very similar to call. So we can do it as inner function dot apply and the context in which I want to execute this function. In this case I want to execute in this obj context, okay, that is this will point to obj, okay, because here this will point to obj, so here also this will point to obj object. The third way is to use a bind. Here you can use bind, okay, but the bind differs to call and apply because it doesn't call the function upfront, but it returns the reference to the inner function which can be called later. So it here I am saying the bind method that bind this function to this context, that is obj context, and I am calling the function later, okay. So this will also make it happen. This refers to obj object here, and this here also will refer to obj object, okay. The other simplest way to do this is to follow ES6. Here I have just followed ES6 methodology of creating functions, okay. So I have used ES6. I have not done anything special here. I have just used ES6. If you do like this, by default ES6 function style does not have this of its own, so it will always follow this of the scope in which it is enclosed. So lexical scoping it uses to the parent function where it is enclosed. So this function is enclosed in this function, so this will point to this only. So here without doing anything special you are able to make use of the parent object, okay. Other way of doing it is using temporary variable. here you are not changing the context. In case of temporary variable, we are not changing the context, but we are introducing a variable which will point to the object context. So in this case, I am creating a variable, extra variable, that which will point to the parent context. So that points to this. So in that we have stored the object context, and using that, we can access the parent context. Okay. So here the point to be taken here is, we are not changing the context, but we are introducing a variable which will point to the parent context. So using that variable, you can access the parent properties or context. Okay. So next will be in the case of callback functions. In case of callback functions, how to access the parent context. So you may think all the ways similar to inner function, you can use all the methodologies to access the parent context, but call and apply you cannot use, because that will call immediately. But in case of callback function, we don't know when it will execute. So we are only left with the three methods: bind, ESSetStyle, and temporary variables. Okay. So call and apply you can't use in case of callback functions, because it will execute immediately. So let's see how we can use bind in case of callback functions. In case of callback function, this is a function I have an inner function. I am calling this inner function. I have put this inner function inside set timeout, which will execute after 1000 milliseconds. And how to make it happen is, you have to use inner function dot bind this. So you are saying whenever this inner function is executing, bind execute this inner function in this context, that is this context of the parent, that is the obj context. Okay. So this will refer. So just you need to add dot bind this. Okay. In case of ESSetStyle, it is very simple. You have to just introduce ESSFunctionStyle, and as I said earlier, it doesn't have the ESSfunctions doesn't have this of its own, so it will always point to this of the enclosing function. So in this case, the enclosing context is of this of the function, so it will point to this. So apparently it will do it point to obj object here. So since this refers to obj object, this will also refer to obj object. So in the case of temporary variable, as I said earlier, we are not changing the context, but we are creating a variable, we are introducing a variable which will point to the parent context, and inside our callback method we can use the same variable to access the parent context or parent variables. So you can see here I have introduced a parent variable, and inside, since it is of lexical scoping, it will be able to access that of the parent scope. Okay. So using this that, you can access the parent variables. Otherwise it is same. Okay. This here will refer to the Windows object, because we have not changed the context. That will refer to the object context. Okay. So similarly for event handlers, as we have done for callback functions, we can change the parent context So event handlers works similar to callback functions, since it is also a callback functions. So event handlers, even in the case of event handlers, we don't know when it will execute. It will execute only on after a user interaction. So even in the case of event handlers, you cannot use call and apply. You can use bind, ESSet style and temporary variable, as I have explained for callback function. Thank you. Kindly post your comments and kindly subscribe. Thank you.